You ready to study God's Word? Come on, get your Bibles out and turn to Luke's Gospel. We're going to be reading some of the Christmas story out of Luke's Gospel today, chapter 2. As we continue our series that we began as the Christmas season started, that we entitled Christmas Odds and Ends. I know that the Christmas story is familiar to almost everyone. Although I will say this, interestingly enough, that we had a conversation not long ago from a person in our neighborhood. And we just, it's Christmas and everybody's putting out all the decorations. And we're not talking about a foreign person or someone that came from another country that might not be acclimated in our culture, but we're talking about an Anglo, white, born in the United States person that we began to visit with. And it wasn't long before we were able to see that they really didn't understand or get or have a handle on the Christmas story. Is that not remarkable in America? Do you know we're finding more and more people in America that just to use simple concepts like pray, that there are people in America that you will say pray and they won't know what that means. That's remarkable. And almost to those of us that have walked with God any length of time, it's almost unimaginable. In fact, those of us that are older, you're talking about my age area now, and I'm getting into my mid-50s. We grew up in an era where everyone knew. It was a cultural fact that everyone understood Christmas. Everyone pretty much got the story, whether they had accepted or received Jesus or not. That was pretty much across the board, but that's not the case any longer. And it really is sad. So it just underscores that we've got a lot to do, don't we? We are still ambassadors in a foreign country. We are still aliens in a foreign land. And we need to do our part in order to spread good news. But we were sharing with them the truths of the gospel, and you could tell it was all absolutely new to them. While it may be true that it's new to so many that are out there, to those of us that may be here this morning, we probably have a little bit better handle on the Christmas story. And so I began to think, what can I share with the folks that might be at least new in the sense that, it would capture their attention or their interest. And so I decided that I'd just pull out some odds and ends out of the Christmas story, and I wanted to talk about truths that get lost in the Christmas rush. Again, we all know Mary, Joseph, the wise men, the magi, the angels, the shepherds, familiar story, but there are some things that happened during that first Christmas season that I think are interesting that I'd like to talk a little bit in these weeks. So, as we open up to Luke's Gospel, chapter 2, I'm going to be reading here in just a moment one verse, verse 21. And as you're finding it, I want to remind you that in order for Jesus to be the once and for all sacrifice for all humanity, that when he came to us, he would have to fulfill, the word says, all righteousness. In other words, he had to fulfill all righteousness. In order to be fully God and fully man, he would have to fulfill all righteousness in order for him to be the once and for all sacrifice that would be sufficient for you and I to receive and to believe in order that we might be reconciled back to God the Father. So Paul would later tell us that Jesus comes, and he comes as a baby, literally as the second Adam. And the second Adam, Jesus, had to be everything the first Adam failed at. And so he fulfilled all righteousness, and the fulfillment of all righteousness actually begins in the Christmas story. And as I was beginning to read this text in Luke's Gospel, chapter 2, and I was reading through the whole chapter, all of a sudden, sort of that prophetic edge began to jump in me on one particular location. And so I'm only going to read to you one verse, and in that verse, I believe there's some prophetic implication that's taking place there, so that I got to teach you for just a few minutes this morning, and then I'm going to leap to what I believe is the prophetic application. In other words, what is not just relevant, but I believe what God is saying to you for the future. I believe that there are some future important words that are coming out that you'll need to tune your ear into. The birth of Jesus was highly prophetic. You understand that. You understand that he was the fulfillment of thousands of years of prophecy. That literally in the garden, at the very inception of mankind, that even in the moment of the fall, there was a prophecy concerning Jesus on how the woman would travail and give birth, and that her seed would actually crush the serpent's head. And so we immediately begin to see prophecies concerning the Messiah come to pass even in the earliest chapters of the Bible. And so now with Jesus arriving on the scene, it's becoming even more prophetic, because Bethlehem was prophesied hundreds of years in advance that that would be the city that the Messiah would be born in. Is that not amazing? I mean, Isaiah prophesied in both chapter 7 and chapter 9 concerning Jesus, how a virgin would conceive and give birth to the Messiah. In chapter 9, that his name would be Wonderful Counselor, Prince of Peace, Almighty God, Everlasting Father. And the government would be upon his shoulders. I mean, all of these passages come from the Old Testament. And so the arrival of Jesus was a highly prophetic moment. Scores of passages were being fulfilled in that instance. And as I remind you of those facts, which many of you would shake your head and say, you're right, Pastor, that's exactly what was going on. I want to take the leap from those prophetic moments and just give you an expectation that I believe that even in the Christmas story, there's some more prophetic moments that I think we can learn from. And so I entitled our sermon today, The Prophetic Implication of Circumcision. The prophetic implication of circumcision. Because here in verse 21, there is a word, and I'm trying to make my way here. Luke 2:21, that comes up right in the middle of the Christmas story, and it says these words. Luke 2:21. Listen carefully. And when 8 days were completed for the circumcision of the child, meaning Jesus, his name was called Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. The prophetic implication of circumcision. Here we are about 8 days after the birth of Jesus. So we're right in the middle still of the Christmas story. And we find Joseph and Mary presenting their newborn son in the temple for the rite of circumcision. Now, if you have one of those Bible maps in the back of your Bible, you can see that Bethlehem was only about a 5-mile journey from Jerusalem. And so it would have certainly been a laborious journey to go back to Jerusalem, and one can only imagine the dedication of Mary to the law of God and to the precepts of the Lord as a mother who only after 8 days from giving birth is back on a donkey riding to Jerusalem. I don't know about you moms. I'm not sure many moms are ready 8 days after birth to go donkey riding. So perhaps the moms at least will have a far greater respect for this young mom who not only was pregnant riding to Bethlehem, but then immediately after she gave birth was riding back to Jerusalem. Now in our house, whenever we read this story, we personally like it because it demonstrates really just how important it is to get your kids in the house of God as quickly as possible. I realize that different births entail different things, so I understand. I'm not going to give some blanket statement here that all the moms, can feel guilty over or whatever the case may be. My intention is not for anyone to walk away and feel guilty about how they gave birth, and maybe there were complications, and maybe it didn't work out like it normally should work out. So keep the missiles down for just a moment. I'm simply saying by way of general precept, you need to get your children in the house of God as quickly as possible. I mean, my children, and again, we just may be unusual. I know Kaylin was there in a week. Tyler and Clay were both there in just a few days. You say, well, aren't you afraid they'll get a disease? Listen, this whole world's full of disease. And there's no better place for them to go than the house of God. So again, I'm just sowing things here. I'm not saying if you had maybe you had a C-section and the recovery's tough and it's going to take some time. I get that. So, but I'm underscoring in everyone's psyche that especially to moms, and we love you, moms, we love you, but birth doesn't mean it's like you get 9 months off then from church. I mean, there are women in Thailand giving birth to babies as they're in the rice field. So again, I'm not being uncompassionate, and I know ladies are saying right now, well, you're a man, how dare you? And I understand. I probably don't have any right to say that, except Jesus was in the temple 8 days after Mary gave birth. So I'll just leave it at that. Amen. He was 8 days old, and he was presented for circumcision. Now, what is circumcision, and what are the reasons for it? Well, as delicately as I can explain it on a Sunday morning, to those who may not know, and believe it or not, there are some who do not know, it is a procedure of cutting away a certain portion of skin on a man's reproductive organ. Circumcision. Now, as with many of God's requirements in the Old Testament, this had a religious significance as well as some practical significance. Now, in a moment, I'm going to explain how some things changed under a new covenant. But as we're dealing in the Old Testament, there were some benefits. In fact, there were actually dual benefits in the Old Testament with regards to the rite of circumcision. Now, keep in mind, much like the prohibitions we find under an Old Covenant of avoiding things like pork, Jews did not eat pork. They were told to stay away from shellfish. There were other restrictions that God had given to them under an Old Covenant, which were related both to their faith and what he asked of them, as well as to their health. It's amazing how God knows some things that we might not have known, particularly in that era when certain things were available that would have caused health difficulties, and God just said, for my people, you just stay away from it. Well, if you can begin to get that mentality and understanding as we sort of work through the rite of circumcision, you'll sort of understand the same thing. Circumcision had certain health benefits to the Israelis, as well as it was God's requirement by way of a mark upon the people. And so we know, and I understand you can Google this, and everybody may go out of here and Google circumcision after service today. And you can see that there's this great debate that goes on as to whether or not you should have a procedure like this. And it is not my intent either to get into whether or not today, under a new covenant, whether or not your children should be circumcised or not. I'll leave that into the parents' prerogative. But I will tell you that in those days, in an old covenant, that there were health benefits with regards to hygiene and infections and diseases and even cancers, which gave Jewish men longevity of life. Now, again, in this era that we live in, I get that there are ways to address certain things outside of just how we practice healthy lives. I understand all of that. I understand that the day we are living in, we understand how to handle pork. We understand how to handle shrimp and lobster. I understand we can handle these things. And so, it's different by way of health benefits. Although, if you choose to eat bacon your whole life, don't be surprised if about 5 of your heart arteries don't clog up. But nonetheless, we know how to handle it in ways that at least we can begin to eat it. So don't get wound up in the health benefits at this particular moment. I'm just simply saying that God knows what was needed then, and he tells them that this is what I want to take place. Now, beyond the potential health benefits and the health issues, what is important for us today is to understand the significance of the spiritual issues that were connected in the act of circumcision. Because if God commanded circumcision, and perhaps it didn't change, we'll talk about it in just a moment, then it could be a relevant aspect for men even today. So let's talk about circumcision and what it represented. Because Jesus was presented 8 days for this act to take place upon him. Number one, what did circumcision represent? Number one was that it was a covenant mark. God had a covenant mark upon his people. Now understand, it was a patriarchal society. It was extremely patriarchal in the Old Testament. And God put the mark upon the men. And there were reasons, and I'm going to get into those reasons, but it was God who said that this would be the covenant mark upon my people. And in those particular days, while circumcision may have been taking place on occasion in the ranks of other peoples in other nations, predominantly it wasn't happening. And so for the Jewish people to embrace the rite of circumcision in that era was a very unique thing. And God said, out of this uniqueness, I am marking my people. And there are reasons for the mark. It would be the covenant mark. It would be the reason that God would stamp, and some things would be spoken out of that. So it was a covenant mark. God always puts a covenant mark on his people. Number two, the reason for circumcision was obedience. You know, to be called uncircumcised, and there are moments in the scripture that the word uncircumcised is used. One of the great moments that word is used is when David was challenging Goliath. You recall the armies of Israel and the Philistines were paralyzed on top of two mountains. Those of you that don't know the story, it is really an interesting story. Saul's army, the Israelites, were on one mountain. The Philistines were on another mountain, and they were paralyzed. And the reason they were paralyzed is because neither army wanted to go down into the valley to attack the other one going uphill. Any of you that might even remotely know about military tactics knows that whoever has the high ground has the advantage. And so both armies had high ground, but in order to attack the other army, one of them would have to decide to go into the valley. And so they were paralyzed, and nobody wanted to move. And so Goliath came out, who was this giant of a man, and he began to taunt the armies of Israel. And they were going to decide the battle as two men would fight, as was standard operating procedure in military situations like this. And so Goliath was taunting and calling down someone to fight him, but here you have probably a 6'9" giant of a man holding armor that was probably 100 pounds, had never lost a battle, an imposing figure, calling out for someone to come down, and no one wants to go fight him until David comes along, who was sent by his dad to carry lunch to his brothers who were paralyzed in the army on the battlefield. And so David comes along and he sums up the situation. And he says the greatest phrase in the world. David does. He says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine who taunts the armies of the living God?" And it's interesting in that phrase, he uses the terminology uncircumcised. What David is saying to the armies of Israel really is, this guy's not marked by God. He's not carrying a covenant mark. He's in disobedience. They are stiff-necked. They are hard-hearted. Why are we paralyzed by such a group as this? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? He says these words. And so circumcision is a sign of covenant mark and obedience. Obedience to God. Obedience to his ways. Obedience to his will. When a man was circumcised, it indicated that there would be an obedience to God whom he served. Number three, circumcision represented a generational promise of a people. A generational promise of a people. Now, if you think about it, it's pretty obvious, it would seem to me, that the location of the covenant mark indicated that this promise was generational in scope. Just as sin and destruction and the alienation from God was transferred through the seed of Adam, so the covenant would be transferred through the generations. In fact, I'll get back to this again, but when Abraham was given the promise, as he was brought out of the tent on the plains of Ur and told to look at the sky, and God said, "So as the stars are numbered in the sky, so shall your descendants be," it blew Abraham's mind, because number one, he was old, and number two, it was like, how could I have that many children? But what God was saying was this. He was saying, my covenant that I am going to make is going to endure, or it's going to last through the generations. And so it was marked on a man's body in such a way that it would be a reminder that the seed of God would be transferred and the covenant of God would be transferred from one generation to another generation. And so circumcision indicated that there was a promise of God to his people that his covenant would endure all through the generations. Number four, circumcision indicated purity. Purity. Circumcision represented a cutting away of the world, its sensualities, its worldly lusts and pleasures were being taken away. You know, God understands that we were created and wired for sexual experiences, but you understand all of those experiences are to happen under a covenant and under his precepts. In other words, while we're wired for sexual experience, that doesn't mean, we just have these unbridled sexual experiences. God says, no, this works within a framework. Works within marriage. It works within covenant. It's an expression of covenant. And within that covenant, there is purity. And that's what it was indicating here. And literally in the act, there was a cutting away, because there's no more powerful drive in a human being than probably the sex drive. And so circumcision represented the desire for purity and the desire for righteousness. And so, and again, whenever we're talking about this, which it is a big concept in the scripture, circumcision, and I understand talking about this concept, it's challenging because of what it's all about, so you have to be delicate, because I understand I've got a mixed gendered audience here. I have young people here, so I'm navigating this as appropriately as possible. But it's important that you understand that if a Jewish man, a man who was carrying the covenant mark, a man that said that he was in covenant with God, with Yahweh, and if he were going to run off and have sexual relationships with women who worshiped foreign gods, let me just tell you, there was no way you could have hidden who you were supposedly in covenant with. Your hypocrisy would be exposed. And so God was really doing a thing here in order to mark them in such a way that they would find themselves to be pure, and they would find themselves to be in covenant with him, which was another reason why it seems that sexual sins tend to have greater repercussion than any other sins we might find in the scripture. And then lastly, I'll put down here number 5, that circumcision indicated consecration. A consecrated moment. And this would be done, circumcision would be done to an Israeli male child by the priest or a rabbi on the 8th day. 8 days after they were born, circumcision, this rite, would be performed on the male. Now, interestingly, the number 8 signifies a new beginning. 6 is the number of a man, 7 is the number of God, and 8 represents, as I understand it, a new beginning. And so as this consecration was taking place, literally what was being spoken of was that this child or this person was being set aside for a new beginning. It would not be as it was before. There's a new beginning going on here. And in terms of the baby, through his parents' presentation, the parents were saying that this child was being set apart for a new destiny as a covenant person. This child would be raised as a covenant person. This child would be raised in a home where it would know the covenant promises, the covenant expectations. It would be set apart, and it would not be as other children, but it would be consecrated as unto the Lord. Are you following me? It's a wonderful illustration of the connection that we as a people can have with our God. Now, there's another interesting picture, and I want to read it to you in the book of Joshua. In Joshua's book, chapter 5, I want to begin reading with verse 2, a passage of scripture here. And as you will recall, the Israelites had been delivered out of Egypt. Moses had delivered them out of their oppression. There had been a generation that had wandered aimlessly in the wilderness for 40 years, and now Joshua comes onto the scene. He will be the leader of the second generation of Israelis. And as they are preparing to go into the promised land, and literally they're going into a new beginning, right? It's a new beginning. The Lord speaks to Joshua, and he says to the people, because they'd wandered in the wilderness and this rite of circumcision had not taken place, he says, before we go into the promised land, we're going to circumcise the males. Now, I want to read this to you because I believe it's a powerful passage, and I believe it illustrates the point. Joshua 5:2, it says, at that time the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives for yourself and circumcise the sons of Israel again the second time. So Joshua made flint knives for himself and circumcised the sons of Israel at the hill of the foreskins. And this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. Now listen to this. All the people who came out of Egypt, who were males, all the men of war, had died in the wilderness on the way after they had come out of Egypt. For all the people who came out had been circumcised, but all the people born in the wilderness on the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. For the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness till all the people who were men of war who came out of Egypt were consumed because they did not obey the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord swore that he would not show them the land which the Lord had sworn to their fathers that he would give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Then Joshua circumcised their sons, whom he raised up in their place, for they were uncircumcised because they'd not been circumcised on the way. So it was when they had finished circumcising all the people that they stayed in their places in the camp till they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, listen, this is the important passage here. This day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. Keep that verse up there because I want to let that sink in. This day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. Therefore the name of the place is called Gilgal to this day. Literally what God was saying was this: there's a new day that's coming. You're going into your promise. Before any promise is going to be received, I am going to give my promise to a covenant people, and I want you to be marked again. And a part of the reason for this marking is to consecrate you. But literally, this is what's interesting. Literally what's going on is that the first generation, though they were circumcised and they were delivered from Egypt, Egypt had not been cut away from their hearts. And now there was another generation who, though uncircumcised, was prepared to go in and take the promises of God, but they were uncircumcised in their body. Now, this is going to be a very important concept as we get into the New Testament, because you can be circumcised in your natural body, but you're not a part of the circumcision. Are you following me? See, God would eventually say, through the apostles, he would begin to say, listen, circumcision in the body may be okay to do, but that's not the ultimate test of circumcision. It really isn't so much circumcision in your body, it's whether or not you're circumcised in your heart. But in this particular case, Joshua comes to the men and he says this. He says, we've wandered through the wilderness. The past generation has died off. We're ready to go in and take our promises. And the key is we are going to circumcise the men one more time in the flesh. But God says this. He says, understand what's going on here. Understand that this circumcision is meaning something different than the ritual that was going on before. This circumcision means that I'm rolling away the reproach of Egypt off of you. In other words, I'm consecrating you. I'm setting you aside. You are no longer of the world. You're no longer of Egypt. Remember what Jesus said? He said, you may be in the world, but you're not of the world. And you know that word in the Greek literally means you're not cut the same way. Literally, it means that. Ektukasmu, it means that. Cut out of. You are cut out of the world, literally. And so circumcision was the sign of consecration. Now, I want you all to listen to me. Everybody tune in real quick. I understand that there are certain things as men and as women that are unique to our particular gender. And there are certain things, and hopefully we can all say amen. There are certain things, ladies, that you experience that we men will never, ever understand. Amen? See, as men, we're never going to join the club of childbirth. So all we can do is look and just go, because I've been in these discussions before. You know, my wife will talk about childbirth, and there were, you know, she had an easy one, and she had a difficult one. And that difficult one was extremely difficult. And there'll be times, you know, that I've had a problem or something that has gone on, and it will hurt me. But at times she'll look at me and say, well, it may hurt bad, but it ain't nothing like having a baby. And what do I do to argue with that? I can't argue with that. That's a club I will never join. And that's a club that men will never join. When you ladies are talking about your childbirthing experiences, we just walk another way because we can't even identify with all of that. So we can't join that club, and everybody gets that. The men get it, and the ladies certainly get that. But let me just say something, ladies. There's something that you will never fully appreciate. You may think you do, but you will never fully appreciate that as men, as we are sitting here, and we think about Joshua creating a flint knife out of stone, circumcising the men. I'm not sure you can fully appreciate that like the men would appreciate that. The trauma of childbirth we give you. We'll never understand it. You're probably right. It's probably something you will far eclipse us in sheer trauma. I will give it to you. But I'm just here to say to you, ladies, you will never get that passage like the men probably get it. I freely admit that as a man, I may not understand women, but I want you to know, and I just want to communicate, and that's why I'm lingering here, that when we're talking about this consecration wasn't something easy. This consecration wasn't something that you just said, yeah, I think I'll try that. Yeah, is there a sign-up sheet on that one? I'll just sign it up on the sign-up sheet. No, let me tell you, you're going to consecrate yourself for this promise. You had some things on the line. I'm just trying to be delicate. You understand? Now you need to get this picture when I'm talking about this, because in the era we live in, we don't get consecration. We think consecration is just this easily entered into thing. Let me tell you something. Consecration is a lot. There's a lot to this thing. It's a big deal. And the reason I'm sort of painting this picture under an old covenant is because while it will not be mandated under a new covenant, don't misunderstand that the act of consecration is no less costly. It's a big deal. So let's get to why Jesus was circumcised. Why was Jesus circumcised? The most simple answer is what I mentioned as we started, and that is he fulfilled all righteousness. He had to fulfill the law in order to set us free from the law. He was entering into all aspects of what I just shared to you as all the reasons a male child was circumcised. So this act upon Jesus wasn't simply a religious ritual, but rather it was a prophetic sign. He embodied all of these things. He embodied them in perfection. He was the one whom, as he goes through even this rite of passage, he's identifying with every male child that was born within the tribe of Israel. Now, it is true, he was from God. Jesus was indeed God himself, but he was also fully man. He was a part of the promise. He too was God's son. And so he enters into this on our behalf. Did he need to be physically circumcised? Well, of course not. He was God. But the fact of the matter is, Jesus didn't need to do a lot of things, but he did those things in order that he would walk into obedience so that therefore we could identify with him. Now, the bottom line is, as I just set all of this up, is what does that mean for us? All right, this one little passage here that I don't know that I've ever heard a sermon on it. Maybe you have. But what does it mean for us? What does it mean for both the men and the women? You know, the greatest controversy in the early church was the issue of circumcision. If you go back and read in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 15, you'll find out that the first church conflict was over the issue of circumcision. They had all of these uncircumcised Gentiles coming in, and they didn't know what to do with them. Now, this is what's interesting as you read the Bible. In, I believe it's Matthew, and I'm doing this off the top of my head, Matthew, I believe chapter 15, and then I think it's 10 and 15, you will see Jesus speaking to his disciples, saying some interesting words. He says, don't go the way of the Samaritans, don't go the way of the Gentiles, only go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And he says that on two different occasions. It's almost as if he's keeping it away from the Gentiles. And I remember the first time I ever read those verses and really thought about it, I thought Jesus was for everybody. And it looks like, in those passages, that actually he's being rather exclusive at that point. And I've come to the understanding that when Jesus came, and we can get into all the nuancing, I'm just kind of giving it to you in a general summation. But when Jesus came, I believe God's full intention was to renew and reestablish the covenant that had been broken through Abraham. And that he was going to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, to Abraham's literal seed. Because from the very inception of the covenantal promise, it was a mandate to the Jews that they were to go to all the nations of the world. Do you understand? They were to proselytize all the nations of the world and to declare to them the truths of Yahweh. That was always the mandate. But you know what happened. It became a real exclusive club. But yet Jesus came in order to reestablish those things. And how many of you can agree, and you know this to be true, that if there's somebody that's stubborn along the way, stubbornness does not stop God? Isn't that good news? You can be stubborn, but it won't stop him. Oh, no. That to me, that gladdens my heart. You can have stubborn people all around you, but that won't stop God's purposes coming your way. And yeah, he faced a stubborn, stiff-necked people. And so in Matthew chapter 21, I believe, is the parable of the vineyard. And he tells the parable about how the landowner would send all of these servants to go to see how the land was being tended, and the people would kill the servants. And then the landlord says, well, I'll send my son. Surely if they see my son, they won't kill him. And then the parable, as you're aware of, says that they even killed the son, and it was a prophetic picture of Israel participating in the killing of Jesus. And it was out of that parable that Jesus says these words. He says that he was going to transfer the fruit of the kingdom to a nation that would produce that fruit. He says, I'm going to transfer this kingdom to a nation that will produce the fruit of it. And I believe at that particular moment, what Jesus was saying was, y'all can be as stiff-necked. Israel, you can be as stiff-necked as you want to be. It will not stop the plan of God from going forward. And it was at that moment, I believe, that a door swung open, that the full heart of God gushed forth, that whether you be Jew or Greek, whether you be Samaritan or Gentile, it did not matter what race you might be, that your salvation was no longer by race, but by grace. But the first test came in Acts chapter 15. Because at the day of Pentecost, it was easy. Because they're all Jews there in the upper room. The Spirit's poured out. They go into the street. Thousands of people are won to the Lord. They're all Jewish. And so there wasn't any issue about all these issues. But now all of a sudden, Acts 15 comes along. You've got Antioch down the road, which was a purely Gentile expression of church life. They sent Barnabas down to figure out what was going on, and he said it was of God. But the problem is these Gentiles aren't circumcised. How can they be Christians if they're not circumcised? Can they be Christians if they're not circumcised? And so the first church fuss was over circumcision. And so they're having this great argument that's going on. And these were fighting issues at that particular time. And we don't exactly know. I believe the book of Galatians is somewhat of a transcript of what took place in Acts chapter 15. We don't know exactly all that happened. We know bits and pieces of what took place. But if you could allow me a little sanctified imagination, I believe the Holy Spirit began to remind them of a couple passages of Scripture under the Old Covenant in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, as you will recall, is the second shot. It's the second giving of the law. It's the second declaration of what God's heart was in the midst of his people. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 12 through 16. Listen real carefully to what goes on. It says this, "And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, and to love him, and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes, which I command you today for your good. Indeed, heaven and the highest heavens belong to the Lord your God, also the earth with all that is in it. The Lord delighted only in your fathers to love them, and he chose their descendants after them, you above all the peoples, as it is this day." Now listen. "Therefore, circumcise" what? "The foreskin of your..." The foreskin of your what? and be stiff-necked no longer. Even there in the Old Testament, God was looking at him saying this, you can do the ritual, but the ritual isn't any good unless circumcision gets in here. Deuteronomy 30, verse 6. Every fact is established on the basis of 2 or 3, and the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that you may live. I'm just sanctified imagination. That in the midst of all those discussions at the Church of Jerusalem, as they were fussing over whether or not you had to get Gentiles circumcised or not, I believe the Holy Spirit reminded them that whether or not you are circumcised in your body, it's no longer a sign of the covenant. It's whether or not your heart has been circumcised. Do you understand? We can walk away with our checklist of rituals that we've accomplished, and it means nothing if the heart is not circumcised. If you're not obedient, if you're not pure, if you're not consecrated, if you're not walking in covenant. All of these things you can check off on your list, but unless it's been circumcised in the heart. And listen to me, ladies, here's really the good news. That circumcision is not just a male event now, it's a woman's event too. Because you can be circumcised in your heart and need to be circumcised in your heart. And truthfully, like the children of Israel, I tend to think that this circumcision comes as a work in the Christian's life. What do I mean by that? I mean this. I mean that for most of us, when we get born again or when we get saved, for most of us, this is just what I believe, we're just working through the trauma of a broken life. We're working through the repentance of a life sometimes that's been ravaged by sin. We're working through the enormity of God's forgiveness. We're blown away by the fact that we were deserving of nothing, and yet God reached down to us, and through the sacrifice on the cross, He reached into our lives as worthless as it was, and He pulled us up, and He calls us son and daughter. That all of a sudden we're translated from darkness into light. All of a sudden the old has passed away and all things have become new. The enormity of that moment is so astronomical that I'm not even sure most believers are prepared at that moment. I'm not saying it couldn't happen. I'm just saying for most of us, I'm not sure we're even remotely ready for the issues of the heart. I mean the deep issues of the heart. And so, for most Christians, I believe, much like the children of Israel pattern it, many of us were delivered out of our bondages. We were delivered out of our Egypts. We were delivered and the chains were broken and we were bought and brought out of all of the problems and issues and challenges of our life. But here's the deal. God brought you out of Egypt, but there comes a place where God wants to cut Egypt out of you. Some of you wonder, why do I keep being drawn back? It's because Egypt's in there still. Egypt's in there. Hey, listen, I'm not even talking about being saved or not saved. Listen, let's just set that to the side for a moment. I'm just talking to good believers here. There's God-fearingness in this room. I mean, you're here because you want to follow the Lord, I would assume. But the question is not, have you been delivered out of Egypt, or you've been delivered out of your problems? And for many of us, we never get beyond that fact, unfortunately. God's always having to deliver us out of something. When I'm telling you, if you'd reach the point where you'd allow a circumcision to take place in your heart, that you wouldn't be drawn back to that Egypt. Now, here's the prophetic part, and I'm almost done. I believe there are 4 acts or promises that God will do if we allow Him to circumcise our hearts anew. I've lived and walked with God long enough that I think I've designed my life pretty much. I'm not saying I'm perfect at it, but if God says it needs to be done in my life, for me, that's good enough. That's obedience. God said it. If you said it, I'll do it. And ultimately, I think that's where we all need to be. But I understand the nature of a human being. Because we always ask ourselves, whether it's out loud or in the back of our head, well, if I let God do something deeper in me, what's in it for me? Because if I were to look at you and say, nothing, I don't think you'd be rushing out to the information desk to sign up for that work of God in your life. Following Jesus has its challenges, no doubt. In fact, following Jesus can actually be incredibly tough. But this much I know about following Jesus. That's what Peter said to the Lord one time. He said, Lord, haven't we given up houses and land and all the rest? And the Lord said to him this. He said, I'll tell you the truth right now. There will be no one who has given up all of these things that I will not restore to him. He says these words, 100-fold, now and in the life to come. So there is a benefit to serving the Lord. But I want to give you 4 things. I mean, just so you can get it inside of you so that maybe you'll open your heart up and let God himself circumcise the heart. Number 1 is this. I believe this is one of the promises of acts of heart circumcision, that he will open a door for you to a new day. That's the number 8. It's a new day. That's the children of Israel. They were walking into a new day. See, many of you want a new day in your life. You want God to close the last chapter and open up the new chapter. You're wanting God to push that past away and open up a new future for you. And we all are there on occasion, and sometimes a lot. We want something behind us to go away, and we want something new to open up to us. Let me tell you, one of the ways I believe that happens is when you allow the Spirit of God to begin to circumcise the heart. He will cause a new day to come. You want a new day? He's not going to give you a new day for your flesh. He's going to cut your flesh to give you the new day. See, if he gave you a new day and you're still walking in the flesh, then you'd treat your new day like your last day. But if he cuts away that flesh and he's able to cut it out of there and circumcise the heart, then your day will not only be a new day because it's a new era, but you'll have new eyes and a new heart to see it in. Are you following me? Circumcision, circumcise the heart, opening a door to a new day. Number 2, I believe the Lord said that if we'd let him circumcise our hearts, again, that he could begin to resolve complicated situations. It's interesting, circumcision comes on the scene in a pronounced way with regards to Abraham and Sarah. Those of you that know the story of Abraham and Sarah, you understand that they were given a promise, right? That they would have a son, and Abraham's seed would be like the stars in the sky. We mentioned that. And all these things that God would do. But the one problem was, and that was Abraham and Sarah were old. That complicated things. It complicated this whole situation because in their natural mind, they're saying, listen, Lord, I think initially Abraham and Sarah were really open to all of this. But they're looking at their age and they're saying, you don't get it. Look at our age. In our bodies, we're dead. This isn't going to happen. And so what they did was they began to try to make this happen themselves, and unfortunately it caused a greater problem. If they would have just allowed God to circumcise, you see, because God said at that moment to be circumcised at that moment, but they didn't get that it wasn't an outward work, it was an inward work that had to take place. And that as your heart is circumcised, there's a level of trust and a level of confidence that can arise in you, that no matter how complicated your situation may be right now, that God would have the ability to resolve a complicated situation. I believe I'm prophesying to somebody right now. That you're in the middle of a really complicated situation. And you're at your wit's end. And you're wanting God to move. And God wants to move, but I'm telling you what the conditioning is on that. God's saying, would you let my Spirit come into your heart and circumcise your heart so that you'll love me, the Lord says, with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. Because right now, you want your circumstance fixed, not so much to serve him better, but you want it fixed because it's just causing you problems. Are you following me? He says, if you'll let me circumcise your heart, consecrate yourself to set you aside, you'd be amazed at what I could do. Number 3. I'm just telling you things that I was impressed by the Lord. Number 3, I believe this internal circumcision can empower men for new territories to conquer. And I'm not speaking men at this point in the generic sense of like mankind, although ladies, I think this applies to you as well. So I'm not saying that you can't apply this, but I want to talk to the guys this morning. Guys, there are territories that God has reserved for us as men to go conquer. Men, we need to be circumcised for his purposes in our hearts. It's a matter of the heart. In the Old Testament time, it was strictly a male event. Only a male could be circumcised. And I just believe God spoke to me out of this. He says, it's an era that I need men to arise, to consecrate themselves again to the great issues of the day, the great challenges of the day. We are walking into an era that it's going to take courage, and it's going to take resiliency, and it's going to take tenacity. And God's calling us not to sit back and hold the fort, but he's calling us to go forward and to conquer new territories. And men, that's us. Don't send the women out to conquer that which is reserved for us. And I believe, men, if we'll let him circumcise our hearts, that in that circumcision, there will be courage. I mean, you would have had to be in Joshua's army, to be men, to see Joshua coming with a primitive flint knife. Wow. That's all I have to say on that. But do you understand that there was something courageous inside of them that said, as we submit ourselves really to the hand of God to circumcise us, that there will be courage that will come in order for us to go into a new territory. And then finally, number 4, the word of the Lord is this. I believe we're going to set in motion a generational blessing. I believe the Lord said that if we would allow him to do a work of circumcision in our hearts, that what we're doing here and how we're living here and how we're serving here will not only impact now, but it will have generational repercussions. I think the greatest act of selflessness might be when you can exhaust your life in something that you can't receive anything from. When you lay your life down for something that serves no purpose for you, but can only be used by those who will come after you. I think probably the hardest thing, I know it would be in my life, because all of us want to see some fruit and benefit to our work, and I think there's an appropriate place for some of that, but understand that for some of us, we're going to lay our lives down for another generation to use us as stepping stones to go to the next place in God. And the question is this: if you're circumcised in your heart, you can be happy with that. You know what I think the mark of a good parent is? It's when they want more for their kids than they themselves perhaps experience. Would you agree with me on that? Isn't there something, I think it's true for me. I get tickled when I watch my children do things I never got to do. I get tickled when they go places I never will go, or they aspire and reach things that I will never aspire and reach to. I think one of the marks of a good parent isn't trying to keep your kids down, but it's actually rejoicing in watching them aspire to something greater. I think that's just a mark of a great parent. I think the mark of certainly spiritual mom or dad, or the mark even of a Christian people, is when we can lay our lives down and there's something inside of us that can look at the next generation and say, you can go farther, you can go more, you can do what we never dreamed could be done. But in order for that to happen, you and I have to lay our lives down for something more. Do you understand? Right now in this room, there are people in Christian history that gave their lives up. They shed their blood so you and I could sit in a climate-controlled banquet room, hear the gospel, enjoy the surroundings, and be able to do all that we do. But somebody laid their life down for us to be able to do this morning. And so the question is, are we willing to do that as well? See, that's what Jesus laid his life down in order that his people might aspire for even greater things than that. Are you following me? And I just saw in the Christmas story that God was saying, let me circumcise your hearts. If God's own son submitted himself to circumcision, how much more would you and I need to submit ourselves to circumcision?
There is an endless song echoes in my soul. I hear